On the 15th of October 1994, in a small apartment on the Rue Ordonnay in Paris, a woman who had spent her entire adult life writing about death, who had mapped its presence in the margins of Nietzsche's notebooks, traced its whisper through Freud's silences, who had made a philosophy of learning to live with what cannot be survived, chose to stop living. She was 60 years old, her name was Sarah Kofman, and the date she selected was not arbitrary. It was the 150th anniversary of Friedrich Nietzsche's birth, the philosopher she had circled for decades, the thinker whose work she had inhabited more completely than perhaps anyone else in her century, the man who wrote that one must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star, and who spent the last 11 years of his own life in silence. His mind collapsed, tended by his sister in a darkened room. Sarah Kofman knew what she was doing when she chose that date. She had spent her career decoding the unconscious logic of symbolic gestures, the way a slip of the tongue betrays a buried wish, the way a forgotten name conceals a remembered wound. And so, we must take seriously that she left us this one final text to read, a death dated to a birth, a philosopher's end tied to a philosopher's beginning, as if to say that some circles once entered can only be closed from within. But here is what the date does not tell you. Here is what requires the whole of her story to understand. 50 years before that October morning, in a different apartment on that same street, the Rue Ordonnay, in the 18th arrondissement of Paris, a little girl had hidden. Not for a day, not for a week, but for years. Hidden from the men who had already taken her father, hidden from the laws that said she should not exist, hidden from the neighbours and the concierges and the police, who might at any moment have knocked on the door and asked a question that could not be answered safely. She was 6 years old when the hiding began. She would not come out of hiding, not fully, not in any way that mattered, for the rest of her life. This is not only a story about philosophy. It is not only a story about survival, or about the Holocaust, or about the strange and terrible ways that trauma writes itself into the body and the mind and the work of a human being across decades. It is all of those things, but beneath them, it is a story about a daughter and a father, about a silence that took 50 years to break, and about what happens when someone finally speaks the unspeakable, and discovers that speaking it does not set you free. Why did Sarah Kofman become the 20th century's most penetrating reader of Nietzsche and Freud, those two great philosophers of suspicion, those two cartographers of the lies we tell ourselves to keep living? Why did she return, again and again, to the question of how language fails us, how meaning slips away, how the things that matter most are precisely the things we cannot say? Why did she write more than 20 books and hundreds of essays circling the same wounds, and then, only at the very end, publish a slim memoir called Rue Ordonnay, Rue là-bas? 80 pages, barely a whisper, the story of her hidden childhood, and die within weeks of its release? These are the questions that pull us forward. And to find anything like an answer, we must go back, slowly, carefully, to a time before the hiding, before the silence, before the philosophy. We must go back to a street in Paris and a family that no longer exists, and a father whose face Sarah Kofman spent her whole life trying not to forget. So settle in. Close your eyes if you like. This is a long story, and we're going to tell it the way she would have wanted. Not rushing toward the end, but dwelling in the middle, where meaning lives, where she lived. We have all the time in the world. The apartment was on the Rue Ordonnay, in a neighbourhood that had once been a village on the outskirts of Paris, and still retained in the 1930s something of that older character. Narrow streets that wound up the hill toward Montmartre. Small shops where the shopkeepers knew your name. Bakeries where the bread was made before dawn. The smell of it drifting up through the windows of the buildings above. It was a neighbourhood of immigrants and workers, of people who had come from somewhere else and were trying to make a life in the city. Many of them were Jewish. Many of them had come from Poland or Russia or Romania, fleeing pogroms and poverty, seeking something they could not quite name. Safety, perhaps, or simply the chance to be ordinary. Berek Kofman had come from Poland. He was a rabbi, which is to say he was a scholar and a teacher, and a man for whom the word of God was not a metaphor but a living presence, a text that required constant interpretation, constant attention, constant devotion. He had been educated in the yeshivas of Eastern Europe, and he carried that education with him like a second skin. the particular rhythm of Talmudic argument, the habit of reading every sentence as if it contained infinite depths, the conviction that meaning was never simple, never finished, always unfolding. He came to Paris in the years between the wars, and he married a woman named Finissa, and together they had 6 children. Sarah was the youngest, born in 1934, a late child, a surprise, a gift in a household already crowded with voices and needs. She would later write that she remembered almost nothing of her father from those early years, a presence more than a person, a voice more than a face. He was often at the synagogue or in his study, bent over his books, and she was too young to understand what he was doing there, why the words on those pages mattered so much that he would sometimes forget to come to dinner. But she remembered one thing. She remembered his fountain pen. It was black, with a gold nib, and he used it to annotate his sacred texts. Small marks in the margins, questions, cross-references, the accumulation of a lifetime's reading. When she was very small, she would sometimes sneak into his study and look at the books on his desk, not understanding the Hebrew letters, but understanding somehow that these marks were important, that they were a form of love, that her father was engaged in a conversation that had been going on for thousands of years and would continue long after he was gone. She could not have known then that she would spend her own life making marks in margins, that she would become a reader of readers, a writer about writers, someone who understood that the most important things are often found not in the text itself but in the spaces around it, the hesitations, the cross-outs, the places where the author could not quite say what they meant. She could not have known that her father's pen would become one of the few objects she carried with her out of the world that was about to end. In June of 1940, the German army entered Paris, the city that had seemed so solid, so permanent, so French, the city of cafes and boulevards, of the Eiffel Tower and the Seine, of artists and writers and the ordinary business of living, fell in a matter of weeks. The government fled south, the army surrendered, and on the 14th of June, German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées, while Parisians watched from the sidewalks, some weeping, some silent, some already calculating what this would mean for them, for their families, for the life they had built. For the Jews of Paris, the calculations were urgent. Many had come to France precisely because it was not Poland, not Russia, not the places where pogroms had been a regular feature of life for generations. France was the country of the rights of man, the country that had emancipated its Jews more than a century earlier, the country where, so the story went, a Jew could be a citizen like any other. Surely the French would not permit what was happening elsewhere. Surely there were limits. There were not limits. There were only laws, and the laws changed with terrifying speed. In October of 1940, the Vichy government, the French government, not the Germans, passed the first statute on Jews, defining who counted as Jewish, barring Jews from public office and the professions, beginning the process of identification and exclusion that would end, for so many, in deportation and death. Over the following months and years, the restrictions multiplied. Jews could not own radios, Jews could not own bicycles, Jews could not use public telephones, Jews had to shop only during certain hours, Jews had to ride in the last car of the metro, and finally, in June of 1942, the yellow star, a piece of yellow cloth, the word Juif stitched across it, to be worn on the left side of the chest whenever a Jew appeared in public, so that everyone would know, so that there would be no possibility of passing, no possibility of pretending to be what you were not. Sarah Kofman was 7 years old when she first wore the star. She would later write that she remembered the shame of it, not understanding at that age what it meant, but understanding from the way adults looked at her that it meant something bad, something that set her apart from the other children, something that could not be undone. But the star was only the beginning. On July 16, 1942, the French police carried out a mass arrest of Jews in Paris. It was called the Vel d'Hiv Roundup, after the Velodrome d'Hiver, the indoor cycling stadium where many of those arrested were held before being transported to transit camps and then to Auschwitz. More than 13,000 Jews were taken that day. Men, women, children, entire families pulled from their beds in the early morning hours, given only minutes to gather a few belongings, then marched through the streets to the waiting buses. The Kofman family was not taken in the Vel d'Hiv roundup. They were not taken because they were warned. Someone, a neighbour perhaps, or a contact through the synagogue, told them the night before that the arrests were coming. and so they scattered. The children were sent to different hiding places, the parents separated. Sarah Kofman was arrested a few days later, on another street, in another roundup, one of the thousands of smaller operations that continued throughout the summer and fall of 1942, as the Germans and the French police worked together to fill the quotas, to fill the trains, to empty Paris of its Jews. Sarah Kofman was 8 years old when her father was taken. She did not see him arrested. She did not say goodbye. One day he was there, the voice, the presence, the man bent over his books, and then he was gone, and she was in hiding, and the world she had known had ended. She would later learn that he was sent to Drancy, the transit camp northeast of Paris where Jews were held before deportation. She would learn that he was put on a train on July 17th, 1942, one day after the Veldiv roundup, one of the very first transports from France to Auschwitz. She would learn that he arrived at the camp on July 19th and that he was killed shortly afterward because he was a rabbi, because the Germans had a particular hatred for religious leaders, because he was 45 years old and not useful for labour, because there was no reason at all, because there did not need to be a reason. She would not learn these things until after the war. During the war there was only silence, the not knowing that was its own kind of torture, the hope that could not quite be extinguished, the fear that could not quite be named, and there was the hiding. The apartment on the Rue Labat was not far from the apartment on the Rue Ordonnez. A few blocks, a different arrondissement, a different world. It belonged to a woman named Mémé, which was not her real name but the name Sarah would call her, a diminutive that meant grandmother but was also something else, something harder to define. Mémé was not Jewish. She was French, Catholic, a woman in her 40s who worked in a shop and lived alone. How she came to hide a Jewish child is not entirely clear. Perhaps through a network, perhaps through a neighbour, perhaps through some act of conscience that emerged fully formed in the crisis and required no explanation. What is clear is that she agreed to take Sarah, and that Sarah's mother agreed to let her go, because the alternative was worse, because there was no alternative, because this is what parents did in those years when the world had become unrecognisable. They gave their children to strangers and hoped. Sarah was 8 years old when she arrived at the apartment on the Rue Labat. She would stay there for more than 2 years, until the liberation of Paris in August of 1944. She would come to call it home, though it was not home. She would come to love Mémé, though Mémé was not her mother. She would learn to pass as a non-Jewish child, to eat pork, to celebrate Christmas, to kneel in church and cross herself and pretend that the God she was praying to was the same God her father had spent his life serving. Though of course it was not. Though of course the pretending was a kind of death. Though of course she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand what had been killed in her during those years of survival. But we are moving too quickly. We must slow down. We must enter the hiding the way she entered it. Not all at once, but gradually, day by day. The strange becoming familiar. The temporary becoming permanent. The unthinkable becoming simply the way things were. The apartment on the Rue Labat had 2 rooms and a small kitchen. The windows looked out onto a courtyard, and beyond the courtyard the backs of other buildings, the ordinary life of a Paris neighbourhood continuing despite everything. Laundry hung on lines, voices calling from windows, the smell of cooking, the sound of radios playing through the walls. To a casual observer it would have looked like any other apartment, any other life, and that was the point. That was the art of hiding. To become invisible not by disappearing but by appearing utterly ordinary, so ordinary that no one would think to look twice. Sarah slept on a small bed in the corner of the main room. Mémé slept in the other room, which was also the bedroom, which was also the place where Sarah would sometimes be told to stay quiet, to not make a sound, to pretend she was not there, because someone was coming, a neighbour, a visitor, anyone who might ask a question that could not be safely answered. The danger was constant, but it was not dramatic. It was not soldiers breaking down doors in the middle of the night. It was the concierge who kept track of who came and went, the grocer who noticed a new face, the child on the street who might say the wrong thing to the wrong person. It was the accumulation of small risks, any one of which could have been fatal, all of which had to be navigated day after day, week after week, month after month. And there was the question of what to tell Sarah herself. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that she must pretend to be someone she is not? How do you explain that her father has been taken, that her mother can only visit occasionally and in secret, that the name she was born with is now a danger, that the star she was made to wear is now a death sentence. How do you explain any of this without destroying the child, without extinguishing the small flame of trust and hope that allows any child to keep going? Meme chose a particular strategy. She chose to make Sarah into someone else entirely, not just in name, but in feeling, in identity, in the deepest parts of herself. She chose to teach Sarah to love the life of hiding, to love the food and the customs and the prayers of the world that was keeping her alive, to love Meme herself with a fierceness that left no room for the other loves that had come before. She chose, in short, to replace Sarah's identity rather than merely to conceal it. And Sarah, because she was 8 years old, because she was terrified, because she had no other choice, because survival sometimes requires forgetting who you are. Sarah complied. The first thing Meme changed was the food. In the Kofman household, on the Rue Ordonnée, the family had kept kosher, the dietary laws that had governed Jewish life for thousands of years, the prohibitions against pork and shellfish, the separation of meat and milk, the prayers said before meals that reminded the eater that food was not just sustenance but sacred. For Sarah, these laws had been the texture of ordinary life, as invisible and as essential as breathing. In Meme's apartment, there was pork. There were sausages made from pig. There was ham sliced thin. There was bacon frying in the pan in the morning. And Meme did not merely permit Sarah to eat these things. She insisted on it. She cooked them with evident pleasure. She praised their taste. She made clear that refusing them would be not only dangerous, a sign that Sarah was not who she claimed to be, but also ungrateful, a rejection of Meme's care and love and sacrifice. And so, Sarah ate. She ate the food that her father had never eaten, that her father would never have permitted her to eat, and she found, this was the terrible part, this was the part she could not stop thinking about for the rest of her life, she found that it tasted good. The bacon was crispy and salty and warm. The sausages burst with flavour. The body did not know the difference between kosher and non-kosher. The body simply took what it was given and said more, please, more. She would later write about this in the memoir she published at the end of her life. She would write about the shame of it, the confusion of it, the way that eating those meals felt like a betrayal of her father and also like a surrender to something she could not resist. She would write about how Meme used food as a form of seduction, how she taught Sarah to associate pleasure with forgetting, how the taste of pork became intertwined with the taste of safety, so that the two could never afterward be separated. But she was 8 years old, and she was hungry, and her father was gone, and there was no one to tell her that what she was doing was wrong, or that it was right, or that it was simply what survival required and nothing more. The second thing Meme changed was the prayers. Sarah had been raised in a household where God was spoken to daily. The morning prayers, the evening prayers, the blessings before and after meals, the Shabbat rituals that marked the week, the holidays that marked the year. Her father was a rabbi. Prayer was not just an obligation, but an atmosphere, a way of being in the world, a constant conversation with something larger than the self. In Meme's apartment, there was a different God. There were statues of the Virgin Mary. There were crucifixes on the walls. There was the rosary that Meme held in her hands as she murmured her evening devotions. And there was the church, the local parish where Meme went on Sundays, and where she took Sarah, because of course she did. Because how else could they maintain the fiction that Sarah was just another French child, just another Catholic girl, nothing unusual about her at all? Sarah knelt in the pews. She crossed herself. She learned the words of the prayers, the rhythms of the Mass, the taste of the communion wafer on her tongue. She stood and sat and knelt when the others did, and she watched Meme's face, and she tried to feel what Meme seemed to feel, the peace, the devotion, the sense of being held by something invisible and vast. And sometimes she did feel it. Sometimes, in the candlelight, in the incense, in the rising voices of the choir, she felt something that might have been God. Not her father's God, not the God of the Hebrew letters and the endless commentary, but some other God, simpler perhaps, or simply different, a God who asked only that she kneel and be still. She would later wonder if this was conversion. She would later wonder if some part of her had truly changed during those years, or if she'd merely learned to perform so well that she could no longer tell the difference between the performance and the self. She would later read Freud and find a language for what had happened to her. Identification with the aggressor, the internalization of the captor's values as a survival mechanism, the way the psyche will do anything, sacrifice anything, to keep the body alive. But at the time there was no language. There was only the church, and the kneeling, and the strange sweetness of belonging, and the other feeling beneath it, the feeling that she was betraying something, someone, though she could not have said who. The third thing that changed was harder to name, because it was not a single thing but an accumulation, a slow reshaping of who Sarah understood herself to be, who she loved, who she belonged to. Meme was not unkind. This is important to say, because the story would be simpler if she had been. The story would be a story of captivity and survival, of enduring a monster until liberation came. But Meme was not a monster. She was a woman who had agreed to risk her life for a Jewish child, who fed that child and clothed her and kept her safe through 2 years of occupation, who did what the child's own parents could not do, which was to keep her alive. Meme was brave, and she was generous, and she loved Sarah in her way, a fierce, possessive, consuming way that left no room for anyone else. And that was the problem. Meme loved Sarah as her own. Meme wanted Sarah to be her own. And slowly, day by day, Sarah began to feel that she was. There were moments when Sarah's mother came to visit, rare, dangerous moments when Finisa would cross the city in secret, risk being stopped and questioned, risk leading the police to the hidden child, just to see her daughter's face for an hour. And Sarah, who should have been overjoyed, who should have run into her mother's arms, found instead that she felt something else, something like resentment, something like discomfort, as if this woman from the old life was intruding on the new one. She would later write about this too. She would write about standing in the doorway, watching her mother arrive and feeling nothing, or feeling something worse than nothing, a wish that her mother would go away, would stop coming, would leave her alone with Meme, who was her real mother now, the mother who fed her and held her and kept her safe. It was a survival mechanism. It had to be. The psyche of a child, faced with the unbearable, will do what it must, will turn away from the unbearable, will attach itself to whatever is available, will learn to love the prison because the alternative is to know that it is a prison and to know that there is no escape. But knowing this, naming it, did not undo it. Sarah would spend the rest of her life trying to undo it, trying to return to the mother she had pushed away, trying to recover the father she had never had time to know. She would write books about Freud and Nietzsche, about substitution and deferral, and the impossibility of returning to origins, and every word she wrote would be, in some sense, about this, about the child in the doorway, watching her mother arrive, feeling nothing. There is a photograph from this period. Sarah kept it for the rest of her life. It shows her standing next to Meme, somewhere in Paris, the two of them posed as if for a family portrait. Sarah is perhaps 9 or 10 years old. She's wearing a dress that Meme must have given her. Her hair is neatly combed, and she's smiling. A genuine smile, a child's smile, the smile of someone who does not know she is being photographed in the middle of a catastrophe. Meme is smiling too. Her hand is on Sarah's shoulder, proprietary and protective. They look like mother and daughter. They look happy. And in some way they were happy, or they had found something that functioned like happiness. A small, enclosed, private world, where the danger was outside and inside was warmth and food and love. But the danger was never really outside. The danger was in the streets, yes, in the patrols and the roundups and the deportation trains that continued to run, even as the war ground toward its end. But the danger was also inside, in the slow erasure of who Sarah had been, in the forgetting of Hebrew, in the taste of pork on her tongue, in the face of her father growing dimmer with each passing month, because she had no photograph. Nothing but memory. And memory, as she would later learn, is not reliable. Memory is not fixed. Memory is constantly rewriting itself according to the needs of the present. She was losing him. Even before she knew for certain that he was dead, she was losing him. Losing his face, his voice, the feel of his hand on her head when he blessed her on Shabbat evening, the scratch of his beard when he kissed her good night. She was replacing him with Meme, with the church, with the new life, because that was what survival required, because you cannot hold on to the dead when you are trying not to become one of them. And so the years passed. 1942 became 1943, 1943 became 1944, the seasons turned, the war continued, and Sarah Kofman grew older in hiding, becoming someone who was not quite the child her parents had raised, and not quite the person she would later become. someone suspended between identities, between mothers, between gods, waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. The liberation of Paris began on August 19th, 1944, when the French resistance launched an uprising against the German occupation. For 6 days the city was a battlefield, barricades in the streets, snipers on the rooftops, tanks rolling through neighbourhoods that had known nothing but occupation for 4 years. And then, on August 25th, the Free French forces and the American army entered the city. The bells of Notre Dame rang out, and Parisians poured into the streets to celebrate. Sarah was 10 years old. She was still in the apartment on the Rue Labat, still with Mémé, still living the double life that had become, by then, her only life. And now the war was over, or at least the occupation was over, and the hiding was over, and she was supposed to go home. But where was home? The apartment on the Rue Ordonnay still existed, but her father did not. Her mother had survived, hidden elsewhere, and now she came to collect her daughter, to bring her back to what remained of the family. And Sarah, this is the part that haunted her, this is the part she could not forgive herself for. Sarah did not want to go. She clung to Mémé. She screamed. She begged to be allowed to stay. She told her mother that Mémé was her real mother now, that she did not belong to the Kofmans anymore, that the old life was over and could not be resumed. She said these things, this 10-year-old girl who had survived the unsurvivable, and every word was true and every word was a betrayal, and she could not tell the difference. Her mother took her anyway. Of course she did. What else could she do? She had lost her husband and nearly lost her child, and now her child was looking at her with the eyes of a stranger, and there was nothing to be done but take her home and hope that time would heal what nothing could heal. Mémé did not let go easily. There were scenes, confrontations, accusations. Mémé wanted to keep Sarah. Mémé had saved her, had risked everything for her, and now she was being asked to give her up, to return her to a woman who could not even protect her, who had handed her over in the first place. The injustice of it was real. The injustice of rescue, the impossible debt that can never be repaid, the way that saving someone's life gives you a claim on them that never entirely expires. But Fineza won, because she was the mother, because the law was on her side, because the war was over and the old rules were supposed to apply again. And Sarah went home, and she never fully forgave any of them. Not her mother for taking her away, not Mémé for making her love her so much, not her father for dying, not herself for surviving. The years after the war were years of silence. No one wanted to talk about what had happened. The French wanted to believe they had all been resistors, that collaboration had been the exception, that the deportation of 75,000 Jews, most of whom had been arrested by French police, not Germans, was somehow an aberration that had nothing to do with France itself. The survivors wanted to rebuild, to return to normal life, to stop being defined by what they had lost, and the children, the hidden children, the orphans, the ones who had been sent away and had come back changed. The children had no language for what had happened to them, no framework for understanding it, no one who wanted to listen. Sarah Kofman returned to school. She was a good student. Brilliant, actually. The kind of student who reads everything and remembers everything and argues about everything. She threw herself into her studies with a ferocity that was, perhaps, its own kind of hiding. A way of escaping the past by fleeing into books, into ideas, into the life of the mind where everything could be analysed and understood and kept at a safe distance. She graduated at the top of her class. She went to university. She studied philosophy, and in philosophy she found what she had been looking for. A language for talking about the things that could not be said directly, a way of approaching the wound without touching it, a discipline that prized exactly the kind of oblique, circling, endlessly interpretive thinking that her father had practiced with his sacred texts. She read Nietzsche. She read Freud. She read Derrida, who would become her friend and colleague, who was also a Jew from elsewhere, who was also asking questions about what could and could not be spoken, about the limits of language, about the way meaning always slips away just when you think you have grasped it, and she began to write. But that is the story of her becoming, and we are not yet done with the story of her beginnings. We have rushed ahead, as memory does, as narrative always wants to, leaping to the resolution, the career, the books, as if these things explain what came before. They do not explain. They do not even describe. They are what she built on top of the wound. and to understand them we must return to the wound itself, must dwell there longer than he is comfortable, must ask what it was like to be that child in that apartment, in that silence, waiting for a father who would never come home. So let us go back. Let us return to the Rue Labaye, to the small bed in the corner of the room, to the nights when Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of the city, and wondering if tonight was the night they would come for her too. Let us stay with her in the darkness, in the not knowing, in the long middle of the war when the end was not yet visible and might never come. She was 8, 9, 10 years old. She was a child. And she was learning lessons that no child should have to learn, that the people who are supposed to protect you cannot always protect you, that the world is not safe, that love is not enough, that you can survive things that should not be survivable, and that surviving them changes you into someone you do not recognize. She was learning to read faces. She was learning to hear what people were not saying, to detect the lie beneath the reassurance, the fear beneath the smile. She was learning that adults did not always tell the truth, that they hid things to protect you and hid things to protect themselves, and that the difference between these two kinds of hiding was not always clear. She was learning that she could become someone else, could speak differently, pray differently, eat differently, feel differently, and that this becoming was both a kind of death and a kind of freedom. She was learning that identity is not fixed, that the self is not a rock but a river, and that the river can be dammed, diverted, forced into new channels by the pressure of circumstance. All of this she was learning, though she did not know she was learning it. All of this she would spend her life trying to understand, trying to articulate, trying to turn into a philosophy that could explain not just her own experience, but the experience of being human in a world that does not care whether you survive. And beneath it all there was the silence about her father, the not knowing that was worse than knowing, the hope that corroded because it could not be confirmed, the grief that could not begin because it had nowhere to land. She did not know where he was. She did not know if he was alive. She did not know that he had been murdered within days of his arrival at Auschwitz, that his body had been burned, that there was no grave, no marker, nothing but ash. She would not learn this for years, and when she learned it, she would not speak of it for decades. The silence became its own structure, its own architecture, a room inside her that she could not enter, could not even look at, could only walk around for the rest of her life, knowing it was there, knowing that everything else she built was built on top of it. This is what it means to be a hidden child, not just to hide, but to be hidden from yourself, to become a secret, to learn that your survival depends on the erasure of everything you were, and that this erasure is a gift, a mercy, the only kindness the world has left to offer. You're hidden from the police, from the neighbours, from the concierge who watches the stairwell, from the children in the courtyard who might ask questions you cannot answer. But you're also hidden from yourself, from the girl you were before, from the family you belonged to, from the name your father called you, and the prayers he taught you, and the smell of his coat when he came home on Friday evenings. All of that is dangerous now. All of that must be put away, locked in a box you do not open, buried so deep that even you begin to forget where you put it. Sarah Kofman was hidden in an apartment on the Rue Ordonnay, in the home of a woman she would call, in her memoir, Mémé. A Christian woman, a rescuer, a woman who saved her life and in saving it, claimed it. The arrangement was simple on the surface. Sarah would stay with this woman, would be safe, would be fed and clothed and kept away from the roundups and the transports. Her mother would visit when she could, would bring what money she had, would sit in the apartment and watch her daughter becoming someone else. It was a rescue. It was also a kind of theft. And the line between these two things would never be clear to Sarah. Not then, not later, not in all the years she spent trying to understand what had happened to her in that apartment, in that war, in that childhood that was not quite a childhood. Mémé was not cruel. This is important to understand. She was not a villain, not a monster, not someone who set out to harm the child in her care. She was a woman who took an enormous risk, who opened her home to a Jewish girl when doing so could have meant her own death, who fed Sarah when food was scarce, who kept her warm when coal was rationed, who protected her from the Gestapo and the French police and the neighbours, who might have turned them both in for a reward. She saved Sarah's life. This is an objective fact, and it must not be minimised. But she also did something else, something that would take Sarah decades to name, something that had no word in the vocabulary of heroism and rescue, that we use to talk about the war. She made Sarah her own. It began, as these things often do, with food. Sarah arrived at the Rue Ordonnay thin, pale, anxious, a child who had been living on whatever her mother could provide in a time of rationing and scarcity. Meme fed her well, fed her abundantly, fed her the kind of food that Jewish dietary laws forbade. Pork, shellfish, meat cooked in butter, all the richness that Sarah's body craved, and her conscience, what was left of it, resisted. At first Sarah refused. At first she held to the laws her father had taught her, the laws that marked her as his daughter, as a Jew, as someone who belonged to a people with a history and a covenant, and a way of being in the world. But hunger is a powerful argument, and Meme was patient, persuasive, kind in a way that felt like love. She did not force. She offered. She waited. She let the smell of cooking fill the apartment, let Sarah watch her eat, let the refusal become more and more difficult to maintain. And eventually, inevitably, Sarah ate. This moment, the first bite of forbidden food, appears in Kofman's memoir as a turning point, a fall, a betrayal that could not be undone. She writes about it with a precision that suggests she had replayed it in her mind thousands of times, had analysed it from every angle, had tried to understand what it meant and what it had done to her. She was a child, she was hungry, she was doing what she needed to do to survive, and yet she experienced it as a kind of death. The death of the girl who was her father's daughter, the death of the self that had been formed by his teachings, his prayers, his presence in her life. With each bite she became someone else. With each bite she moved further from him and closer to Meme. With each bite she was surviving, and she was betraying, and she could not tell where one ended and the other began. Meme understood something about children that Sarah's mother, in her grief and her exhaustion and her desperate love, could not see clearly. She understood that children are malleable, that their loyalties can be shifted, that the bonds of blood and memory are not as strong as the bonds of daily care, of physical presence, of the person who feeds you and clothes you and puts you to bed at night. She did not set out to steal Sarah from her mother, but she did set out to make Sarah love her, and she succeeded. She succeeded so completely that Sarah began to resist her mother's visits, began to see her mother as an intrusion, began to feel that her real home was here, with Meme, and that the woman who had given birth to her was a stranger, a burden, someone who reminded her of things she did not want to remember. This is the cruelty at the heart of the rescue, and it was a cruelty that had no villain, no perpetrator, no one to blame. It was simply what happened when a child was torn from her family and placed in the care of someone else. The body does not know about loyalty. The heart does not consult the conscience. Sarah needed to be held, needed to be fed, needed to feel safe, and Meme provided these things. Her mother could not. Her mother was broken, grieving, barely surviving herself, coming to visit with empty hands and hollow eyes, bringing nothing but the memory of a father who was gone and a life that had been destroyed. Of course Sarah turned away. Of course she reached for the warmth that was offered. She was a child. She did what children do. And yet she knew even then that something was wrong. She knew that her love for Meme was a betrayal, that every moment of happiness in that apartment was a moment stolen from her mother, that the self she was becoming was not the self she was supposed to be. She knew, and she could not stop. This is the particular torture of the hidden child, to be rescued into a kind of captivity, to be saved by someone who is also, in some sense, taking you prisoner, to be unable to distinguish gratitude from resentment, love from dependence, survival from surrender. Sarah learned this lesson in the apartment on the Rue Ordonnay, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to unlearn it. The war went on. The seasons turned. Winter to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn back to winter again. Sarah grew taller, stronger, more fluent in the language of her new life. She learned to eat what Meme ate, to pray as Meme prayed, to think of herself as someone who belonged in this apartment, in this family, in this world that was not her world. She learned to push the memories of her father further and further away, to seal them in that room she could not enter, to build her new self on top of them as if they were a foundation rather than a wound. She did not forget him. You do not forget your father. But she learned not to think about him. not to speak about him, not to let the thought of him intrude into the daily business of survival. She became skilled at this, as hidden children do. She became an expert in the management of memory, in the art of selective amnesia, in the construction of a self that could function in the present by refusing to look at the past. And her mother watched. Her mother visited when she could, and watched her daughter becoming someone else's child. She saw the way Sarah looked at Meme, the way she reached for Meme's hand, the way she smiled when Meme entered the room. She saw the way Sarah stiffened when she herself arrived, the way her daughter's eyes went flat and guarded, the way the warmth drained out of the room. She saw, and she could do nothing. What could she do? Take Sarah back? Take her where? The roundups were still happening. The transports were still leaving. The Jewish children who had not been hidden were being gathered up and sent east, to places whose names were not yet spoken, to fates that could not yet be imagined. There was no safe place for Sarah except this apartment, this woman, this life that was erasing everything her mother had tried to give her. So she watched, she visited, she brought what she could, and she waited for the war to end, hoping that when it ended she could reclaim her daughter, that the girl who had been Sarah would still be there, somewhere, underneath all the layers of protection and disguise. The war did end, eventually, as wars do. The Allies landed in Normandy. The German army retreated. Paris was liberated in August of 1944, and the streets filled with people celebrating, weeping, embracing, settling scores. Sarah was 11 years old. She had spent nearly 3 years in the apartment on the Rue Ordonnay. She had become, in every way that mattered to her child's heart, Meme's daughter. And now her mother came to take her back. What followed was a battle, quiet, domestic, unwitnessed, but a battle nonetheless. Sarah's mother wanted her daughter. Meme wanted the child she'd raised, the child she had fed and clothed and protected, the child who called her by a name that meant grandmother, the child who was, in some sense, the only good thing to come out of the war. And Sarah was caught between them, pulled in two directions, unable to choose, unable not to choose, torn between the mother she had been born to and the woman who had saved her life. She did not want to leave Meme. She said so. She cried. She pleaded. She refused. And her mother, desperate, determined, unwilling to lose her daughter a second time, insisted, took her, brought her back to a home that was no longer home, to a family that was broken, to a life that had to be rebuilt from nothing. The transition was brutal. Sarah mourned Meme as one mourns the dead. She wept, she raged, she retreated into silence. She looked at her mother and saw a stranger, an enemy, someone who had torn her away from the only safety she knew. She looked at the apartment where she was supposed to live, the bed where she was supposed to sleep, the food she was supposed to eat, and she felt nothing but loss. The kosher food tasted wrong. The prayers sounded strange. Everything that was supposed to be familiar had become foreign, and everything that had been foreign, Meme's cooking, Meme's voice, Meme's way of holding her, had become the only thing she wanted. This is what the war did to children, not just to the ones who were killed, not just to the ones who starved or froze or were murdered in the camps, but to the ones who survived. It broke them in ways that could not be seen, could not be measured, could not be healed by victory or liberation or the passage of time. Sarah survived. She was one of the lucky ones, if luck is the word for what she experienced. But she survived as a divided self, a self that had been split in two and could not be made whole again, a self that would spend the rest of her life trying to understand what had happened to her and what it meant. Her mother tried. We must give her this. She tried to reconnect with her daughter, to rebuild the bond that had been severed, to remind Sarah of who she was and where she came from. She talked about Sarah's father, about his kindness, his learning, his devotion to his family and his faith. She kept his memory alive in the only way she could, by speaking his name, by telling stories, by refusing to let him disappear entirely into the silence that had swallowed him. But for Sarah, this was not comfort. It was accusation. Every mention of her father reminded her of what she had done, how she had eaten the forbidden food, how she had turned away from his teachings, how she had loved another woman more than she loved her own mother. Every story was a judgment. Every memory was a wound. and so she did what children do when they cannot bear the weight of their own guilt. She turned it outward. She blamed her mother for taking her away from Mémé. She blamed her mother for the poverty, the cramped apartment, the struggle to survive in a world that had been shattered. She blamed her mother for not being Mémé, for not having Mémé's warmth, Mémé's plenty, Mémé's uncomplicated love. She could not blame herself. The guilt was too great, the shame too deep. So she blamed the person closest to her, the person who had given her life and was trying, desperately, to give her a reason to live it. The years after the war were hard. They were hard for everyone, for all the survivors, for all the families that had been torn apart and were trying to reassemble themselves from the pieces that remained. But they were hard in a particular way for Sarah and her mother, because the wound between them was not just the wound of loss and separation. It was the wound of Mémé, the wound of betrayal, the wound of a child's love that had been given to the wrong person and could not be taken back. They lived together, mother and daughter, in an apartment that was too small, and a grief that was too large. They did not speak of the war. They did not speak of the father. They did not speak of Mémé. They circled each other in silence, each carrying a burden the other could not see, each waiting for something that would never come. Sarah went to school. She was intelligent, quick, hungry for knowledge in a way that surprised her teachers and pleased her mother. She read everything she could find: philosophy, literature, history, science. She read as if reading could save her, as if the words of others could fill the emptiness inside her, as if understanding the world could make up for not understanding herself. She discovered that she was good at this, at thinking, at analysing, at taking things apart and putting them back together in new configurations. She discovered that the mind could be a refuge, a place where the chaos of feeling could be ordered, controlled, made to submit to the discipline of logic and argument. She discovered that she could build a self out of ideas, a self that did not depend on the treacherous ground of memory and emotion, a self that could stand on its own, impervious to the wounds of the past. This was the beginning of Sarah Kofman the philosopher. Not the books, not the career, not the positions at universities or the articles in journals. Those would come later. What came first was the discovery that thinking could be a form of survival, that the life of the mind could be lived in parallel to the life of the body, that you could construct an identity out of concepts and theories and systems of thought that owed nothing to the accidents of birth and the traumas of childhood. She did not know yet that this strategy had a name, that philosophers had been using it for centuries, that the very thinkers she would devote her life to studying, Nietzsche, Freud, Plato, Rousseau, had all been engaged in some version of this same project, building intellectual edifices on top of personal wounds they could not or would not examine directly. She did not know that the philosophy she would write would be, in some sense, an extended meditation on the relationship between life and thought, between the thinker and the system, between the wound and the work that is built on top of it. All she knew was that thinking made her feel less alone, less broken, less at the mercy of a past she could not change and a future she could not imagine. She graduated from school at the top of her class. She went on to the lycée, then to the university, then to the aggregation, the brutal competitive examination that determines who will be allowed to teach philosophy in France. She passed. She passed brilliantly, one of the few women of her generation to do so, one of the even fewer Jews, one of the smallest handful of hidden children who had somehow found their way from the wreckage of the war to the heights of the French intellectual establishment. She became a professor. She began to write. She married briefly, unhappily, and divorced. She formed friendships, intense and complicated, with other philosophers, other writers, other wounded people who had found in ideas a way to live with their wounds. And through it all, she did not speak of the war. She did not speak of her father. She did not speak of Mémé, or of the apartment on the Rue Ordonnée, or of the food that had been her first betrayal, or of the love that had been given to the wrong person and could never be taken back. She wrote about Nietzsche, about his doctrine of eternal return, about his claim that one must love one's fate, embrace it, affirm it, say yes to everything that has happened, including the suffering, including the cruelty, including the senseless destruction that seems to have no meaning and no justification. She wrote about Freud, about his theory of trauma, about the way the mind defends itself against unbearable knowledge, about the return of the repressed and the compulsion to repeat. She wrote about these things as if they were purely intellectual problems, as if they had nothing to do with her, as if she were a scholar examining specimens in a jar rather than a woman who had lived through experiences that these theories were trying to explain. Her colleagues noticed nothing, or if they noticed, they did not say. She was brilliant, productive, original, difficult. She was known for the intensity of her writing, the precision of her arguments, the way she could illuminate a text by reading it against the grain, finding in it meanings that no one had seen before. She was known for her work on Nietzsche, which was among the best being done anywhere in the world. Work that took seriously his critique of metaphysics, his suspicion of the will to truth, his insistence that every philosophy is a kind of confession, a symptom, a revelation of the philosopher's unconscious drives and desires. She wrote these things about Nietzsche. She did not write them about herself, but the wound was there. It was always there, beneath the surface, shaping everything she did and thought and wrote. It was there in her obsession with Nietzsche, the philosopher who had suffered, who had gone mad, who had ended his life in silence and incapacity, cared for by a sister who may have loved him and may have betrayed him and may have done both at once. It was there in her readings of Freud, the Jew who had fled the Nazis, who had written about the death drive, about the compulsion to repeat painful experiences, about the way trauma inscribes itself on the psyche and refuses to let go. It was there in her interest in autobiography, in confession, in the way writers construct selves through language, and the way those constructions both reveal and conceal the truth. She wrote about others, but she was always writing about herself. She analysed their symptoms, but the symptoms were her own, and so she built a life out of interpretation. She became one of the foremost readers of Nietzsche in the world, one of the most subtle and demanding interpreters of Freud, a philosopher who made her name by teaching others how to read. But the question of what it means to read, really read, to penetrate beneath the surface of a text and find what is hidden there, this was never for her a merely academic question. It was the question of her existence. It was the question she had been living since she was 8 years old, since the moment she learned that surfaces lie, that the world you think you know can dissolve in an afternoon, that the people who love you can be taken and the people who take them can smile and fill out forms and follow procedures, all of it perfectly ordinary, perfectly legal, perfectly fatal. She read Nietzsche the way a detective reads a crime scene. She looked for what was missing. She looked for what had been covered up, explained away, normalized into acceptability. She distrusted every summary, every received opinion, every comfortable interpretation that made the text safe and domesticated. She knew that domestication was a form of violence. She knew that making something safe often meant hiding its danger, its wound, its capacity to cut. And so she read with suspicion, with care, with the attention of someone who understood that words can kill, that ideas have consequences, that what you do not notice can destroy you. Her first major work on Nietzsche appeared in the early 1970s. It was called Nietzsche et la Métaphore, Nietzsche and Metaphor, and it was unlike anything that had been written about him before. The book argued that Nietzsche's entire philosophy was organised around a problem that most readers had failed to take seriously, the problem of metaphor, the problem of figuration, the problem of what happens when language says one thing and means another. This might sound abstract, but for Sarah Kofman it was not abstract at all. She understood that metaphor is not decoration. Metaphor is not ornament. Metaphor is the place where language touches what cannot be said directly, where it reaches toward experiences that would shatter into incoherence if you tried to name them outright. Nietzsche knew this. He wrote in metaphors because he was trying to say things that literal language cannot hold. And Sarah Kofman knew it too, for reasons that she did not yet discuss, for reasons that were still locked away in the apartment on the Rue Ordonnay, in the silence about her father, in the body that remembered what the mind refused to speak. She wrote about Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, that infamous phrase that had been so catastrophically misunderstood, appropriated by fascists and strongman ideologues who saw in it a justification for domination. Sarah Kofman read it differently. She read it as a theory of interpretation itself, a claim about how meaning is made and contested and fought over, how every reading is an act of power, how every interpretation involves some violence, some selection, some imposition of one perspective over others. This was not abstract to her either. She had lived through a time when interpretation was a matter of life and death, when the question of who you were, Jew or Aryan, citizen or enemy, human or vermin, was decided by interpreters who held all the power and brooked no appeal. She had survived because she had been successfully reinterpreted, translated from a Jewish child into a French child, hidden not behind walls but behind a new story, a new identity, a new version of herself that could pass through the world without being recognized and destroyed. Interpretation had saved her life, but interpretation had also killed her father. The Nazis had interpreted the Jews as subhuman, and that interpretation had been enforced with gas chambers and crematoria, with bureaucratic efficiency and industrial scale. Sarah Kofman knew that reading is never innocent. She knew that understanding is never merely passive. She knew that every interpretation is also an act, and that acts have consequences, and that the consequences can be irreversible. Her work on Freud was equally penetrating, equally personal, equally unable to be separated from the life that produced it. She wrote extensively on Freud's theory of femininity, on his complicated and often troubling views about women, on the ways his own biases and blind spots shaped his supposedly scientific observations. She was not gentle with Freud. She admired him. How could she not when his work on trauma and repression and the unconscious spoke so directly to her own experience? But she also saw his limitations, his defensive manoeuvres, his tendency to explain away the experiences of women rather than truly hearing them. She wrote about the way Freud had silenced certain voices, ignored certain testimonies, constructed a theory that claimed to explain femininity while actually controlling it, containing it, making it manageable for the male theorist who would come after him. And here again, though she did not say so directly, she was writing about herself. She was writing about what it means to be a woman in a world built by men, a Jew in a world built by Christians, a survivor in a world that would rather forget. She was writing about the difficulty of speaking when the language you must use was not made for you, when the concepts available to you were designed to describe someone else, when even your attempts to name your own experience are filtered through frameworks that distort and diminish what you're trying to say. The years passed. The books accumulated. She wrote on Comte, on Rousseau, on Sarah Bernhardt, on the question of why philosophers so often write about women while so rarely listening to them. She became a fixture of Parisian intellectual life, a professor whose seminars were legendary, whose presence was formidable, whose reputation spread beyond France to the wider world of continental philosophy. Students came to study with her. Colleagues sought her out for collaboration and debate. She was translated into other languages, invited to lecture in other countries, recognized as one of the most important philosophers of her generation. And still she did not speak of the war. Still she did not write about her father. Still she circled around the wound without ever touching it directly, writing endlessly about trauma in the abstract while keeping her own trauma locked away in a room to which she had lost, or perhaps never held, the key. There is a kind of irony in this, though irony is too light a word for something that goes so deep. The philosophers she studied most intensely were the philosophers of suspicion, the masters of unmasking, the thinkers who taught that what appears on the surface is never the whole truth, that there is always something hidden beneath, always something that the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge, always a secret that the text is working to both conceal and reveal. She devoted her life to reading beneath surfaces, to finding what was hidden, to exposing the unconscious operations that shape thought and language and culture, and yet she could not, or would not, or did not know how to apply this same penetrating vision to herself. Or perhaps, and this is perhaps closer to the truth, she applied it constantly, relentlessly, but in a form that she could not yet bring to speech. Perhaps her entire philosophical career was an elaborate, systematic, inexhaustible attempt to understand herself by understanding others, to approach her own wound obliquely, through the wounds of Nietzsche and Freud, through their sufferings and their insights and their failures. Perhaps she was always writing autobiography, but in a code that she herself had not yet fully deciphered. The question of autobiography haunted her. She wrote about it explicitly, analysing the ways that philosophers construct images of themselves through their texts, the strategies they use to present themselves to their readers, the complex interplay between what is shown and what is hidden, between confession and performance, between the self that writes and the self that is written. She examined how Nietzsche crafted his own legend, how he presented himself as a solitary genius, a tragic hero. a man misunderstood by his age and destined for posthumous recognition. She analysed Freud's careful self-presentation, the way he constructed himself as the founder of a new science, the discoverer of hidden continents of the mind, the Moses leading humanity into a new understanding of itself. She saw that both men were engaged in complex acts of self-construction, that their autobiographical writings were not simply descriptions of lives already lived, but active shapings of how those lives would be understood, remembered, transmitted to the future. And she saw that this self-construction was never fully under control, that the texts always revealed more than their authors intended, that the unconscious always leaked through, that every attempt at self-mastery was also an admission of vulnerability. She wrote about Nietzsche's Ecce Homo, that strange and beautiful and troubling book in which the philosopher looks back on his own work and tries to explain what he has done and why he matters. She read it as an act of self-mythologizing, a desperate attempt to control the interpretation of his life before it was too late, before the madness that was already creeping upon him would render him incapable of speaking for himself. She noted the grandiosity, the claims to have shattered all previous philosophy, the announcement of a new epoch in human history. But she also saw the fragility beneath the grandeur, the loneliness, the longing for understanding, the awareness that he was writing into a void, that no one yet existed who could really hear what he was saying. She saw that Ecce Homo was a cry for recognition as much as a declaration of triumph, and that the triumph itself was inseparable from a wound that could never quite be healed. There was something in this that spoke to her directly, though what it said she did not yet put into words. There was something about Nietzsche's situation, the isolation, the sense of being misunderstood, the compulsion to write and write and write, even when no one seemed to be listening, the oscillation between grandiosity and despair, that resonated with something in her own experience, some vibration that she could feel but not name. She wrote about Nietzsche with an intensity that went beyond scholarly interest. She defended him against misreadings with a passion that seemed personal. She insisted, again and again, that his philosophy was not what the Nazis had made of it, that he had been misappropriated, distorted, turned into the opposite of what he actually believed. And in this insistence there was something that was not only about Nietzsche. There was something about the fate of texts, the fate of persons, the way meaning can be stolen, the way lives can be conscripted into causes they would have despised, the way the dead are powerless to correct the lies told about them. Her father's name had been signed to nothing. He had left no texts, no philosophy, no body of work that could be interpreted or misinterpreted. He had been a rabbi, a scholar in his own way, a man whose life was devoted to the reading and interpretation of sacred texts. But he had not written books. He had not published treatises. He had lived his life in the intimate circle of his family and his community, teaching, praying, interpreting the Torah in the weekly rhythms of synagogue life. And then he had been taken, and there was nothing left of him but memory, and the memories were scattered among survivors who were themselves scattered, diminished, dying off one by one. Sarah Kofman had almost nothing of her father. She had a few photographs. She had the fountain pen that he had been allowed to send back from Drancy, the transit camp on the outskirts of Paris where Jews were held before being shipped east. She had the memory of his hands, his voice, his smell, the feeling of being lifted in his arms. And she had the absence, the hole in the world where he should have been, the space that could never be filled no matter how many books she wrote, no matter how many texts she interpreted, no matter how many students she taught or colleagues she impressed or honours she received. The pen became a talisman. It was the last thing he had touched, the last object that had passed from his hands to hers. She kept it with her always, this ordinary fountain pen that had become sacred, that had become the material trace of a man who had otherwise been erased. She did not speak of it publicly, not for decades. It was too private, too precious, too close to the core of her pain. But it was there, a secret relic, a piece of the father she could never get back, a reminder that he had existed, that he had been real, that he had been more than a name on a list of the transported, the deported, the murdered. The pen was proof. The pen was evidence. The pen was all that remained of a life that had been deliberately, systematically destroyed. And in her silence about the pen, about her father, about all of it, there was a kind of faithfulness. She was faithful to the wound by not displaying it. She was faithful to the dead by not making them into spectacle. She wrote book after book, hundreds of pages of closely argued philosophical analysis, and none of it touched directly on her own life, her own loss, her own survival. She was, in this sense, continuing the work of hiding that had begun in the apartment on the Rue Ordonnay. She was still the hidden child, concealed now not behind a Catholic name, but behind the scholarly apparatus, the footnotes and citations and theoretical frameworks that kept her own story at a safe distance. She analysed everyone else's symptoms, but never, in print, her own. Yet even this is too simple, because the hiding was also a kind of showing. The obsessive focus on Nietzsche and Freud was itself a revelation, if anyone had eyes to see. The themes she returned to again and again, trauma and repression, the construction of identity, the difficulty of speaking the truth about oneself, the violence of interpretation, the silence of the dead, these were not chosen at random. They were chosen because they mattered, because they touched something that she could not say in any other way. She was speaking without speaking. She was confessing without confessing. She was using the tools of philosophy to approach the thing that philosophy cannot quite reach, the thing that can only be circled, gestured at, approached asymptotically but never fully grasped. Perhaps she believed, for a long time, that this was enough. Perhaps she believed that the work itself was sufficient testimony, that anyone who really understood her writings would understand what lay behind them, that the careful reader could find her in the space between the lines. Perhaps she believed that some things are better left unsaid, that there is a kind of dignity in silence, that the alternative to silence was something unbearable, a kind of exposure that would be worse than the wound itself. And perhaps she was right. There is no law that says survivors must speak. There is no obligation to turn one's suffering into public narrative. The cult of testimony, the demand that victims tell their stories, can be its own kind of violence, its own kind of appropriation, a way of making private pain into communal property without the consent of those who suffered it. Sarah Kofman's silence was hers. It was not owed to anyone. It was not a debt she was obligated to pay. But silence has its cost too. Silence is not the absence of speech, but a particular kind of speech, a speech that speaks by not speaking, that signifies by its very refusal to signify. And silence can become unbearable. Silence can become a prison. Silence can grow so heavy that it crushes the one who carries it, that it becomes impossible to put down, that it becomes the defining fact of a life that was supposed to be about something else. She was writing about Nietzsche's eternal return, his doctrine that one must affirm life so completely that one would be willing to live it again and again, exactly as it was, forever. She was exploring the paradoxes of this idea, the way it seems to demand the impossible, the way it asks us to say yes to suffering, to loss, to everything that seems to justify despair. And she understood, better perhaps than any other scholar, that this doctrine was not an easy optimism, not a cheerful embrace of existence, but something harder and darker and more demanding. She understood that the eternal return was precisely what could not be affirmed, that it was the test that even Nietzsche himself may have failed, that it represented a horizon of possibility that human beings could approach but never quite reach. And in writing this, she was writing about her own test, her own impossibility, the question of whether she could affirm a life that included the death of her father, the theft of her childhood, the years of hiding and fear, the wound that would not heal. The decades passed. The bibliography grew longer. She wrote and taught and travelled and debated, and the silence at the centre of her life remained unbroken. She did not speak of her father. She did not speak of the war. She wrote about philosophers who had confessed their secrets while keeping her own secrets locked away, and the world turned, and the survivors aged, and one by one they died, and the generation that had lived through the catastrophe began to thin, to fade, to pass into history. And still she said nothing. And the silence gathered weight. And then, somewhere in the late 1980s, something began to shift. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. It was more like the slow turning of a tide, the gradual alteration of pressure that precedes a change in weather. The world was changing around her, and the nature of that change made it impossible to remain where she had been standing for so long. The survivors were dying. That was the first fact, the inescapable fact, the fact that pressed against the silence with increasing weight. The men and women who had been in the camps, who had hidden in attics and cellars and convents and farms, who had walked out of the wreckage of Europe with nothing but their bodies and their memories. They were aging now, they were ill, they were disappearing one by one into the ordinary mortality that had once seemed like such an impossible gift. And as they died, their stories died with them. The testimonies that had never been given would never be given. The silences that had been maintained would become permanent. The things that had been too painful to say would pass into the darkness of everything that is never said, everything that is simply lost. And there was something else happening too, something that made the dying of the survivors feel even more urgent, even more charged with consequence. The deniers were growing louder. The revisionists, the minimizers, the people who claimed that the numbers were exaggerated, that the gas chambers were fabrications, that the whole catastrophe was a conspiracy invented to serve some other purpose. They were always there, of course, from the very beginning. Even before the war ended, there were those who refused to believe, who claimed that the reports were propaganda, who insisted that such things were simply impossible in a civilized nation. But now, in the 1980s, they were organized. They had institutes and journals and conferences. They had the appearance of academic respectability. They were gaining traction in certain quarters, finding audiences that should have known better, exploiting the natural human desire to believe that the worst things are not true, and the survivors understood, with a clarity that came from their bones, that their silence was no longer simply their own. Their silence had become a gift to the deniers. Every testimony that went ungiven was a space in which denial could flourish. Every story that was not told was a story that could be disputed, minimized, erased. The very dignity of silence, the refusal to make a spectacle of one's suffering, the insistence on keeping something private and protected, all of this had become, inadvertently, a form of collaboration with those who wished to make the suffering disappear entirely. Sarah Kofman felt this pressure. She felt it in the conversations she had with colleagues and students, in the articles she read in newspapers and journals, in the growing public discourse about memory and testimony, and the obligations of those who had survived. She felt it too in the silence that surrounded her own life, the silence that had once felt like protection, and now felt like something else, something heavier, something that was beginning to suffocate. And there was another factor, one more personal, more intimate, more difficult to name. Her mother was still alive, the woman who had survived with her, who had shared those years of hiding and fear and displacement, who had borne the weight of widowhood and exile and the impossible task of raising a child in the wreckage of everything that had been. Her mother was still alive, still present, still part of the daily fabric of Sarah Kofman's existence. And as long as her mother lived, certain things could not be said. Certain truths could not be spoken. The story of those years was not Sarah's alone. It belonged also to her mother, and her mother's version of the story, her mother's understanding of what had happened and what it meant, was different from Sarah's, was perhaps incompatible with Sarah's, was perhaps a version that Sarah could not contradict without doing violence to the woman who had kept her alive. The years of hiding had been complicated. That is the word that appears again and again in the later writings, the word that hints at depths that are never fully explored. Complicated. It was complicated because survival itself is complicated. Because the people who saved Jewish children during the occupation were not saints, not simple heroes, not figures of uncomplicated virtue. They were human beings with their own needs, their own desires, their own confusions and contradictions. And the children who were saved by them were placed in positions of impossible complexity, forced to navigate relationships that were charged with gratitude and resentment, love and betrayal, the desire to belong and the knowledge that one did not, could not, fully belong. There was a woman. Her name was Meme, or that was what Sarah called her. The woman who had hidden her, who had taken her in when her mother could no longer keep her safely, who had fed her and clothed her and protected her from the men who came looking. And Sarah had loved this woman. That was the complicated part, the part that could not be easily said, the part that cut against the grain of the story as it was supposed to be told. She had loved the woman who saved her more than she loved her own mother. She had preferred the warmth and stability and abundance of this woman's home to the anxiety and grief and poverty of her mother's. She had eaten the forbidden foods, the bacon and the ham, the foods that her father taught her were unclean, and she had loved them. She had felt in this gentle woman's house a peace that she had never felt before and would never feel again. And her mother knew this. Her mother saw it happening. Her mother came to visit and found her daughter transformed, assimilated, happy in a way that was also a kind of betrayal, a kind of abandonment, a turning away from everything her father had died for. And after the war there had been a fight, a physical fight, a struggle over the body of the child, a contest between the two women who both claimed her, the mother who had given birth to her and the woman who had kept her alive. Sarah Kofman would remember this fight for the rest of her life. She would remember being pulled in two directions, being claimed by two sets of hands, being the object of a conflict that she could not resolve, that she was not equipped to resolve, that would define her relationship with her own divided self for decades to come. How does one speak of this? How does one say in public that one loved the woman who saved her more than one's own mother? How does one admit that survival came at a cost, that the cost was a kind of fracture in the most fundamental loyalties, that one was saved at the price of becoming someone else, someone who could eat forbidden foods and feel at home in a stranger's house, and look at one's own mother with something that was not quite love, or not only love, but also a complicated mixture of resentment and guilt and sorrow? How does one say these things without being misunderstood, without seeming to blame the mother who had already suffered so much, without adding to the weight of grief that had already crushed so many lives? These were the things that Sarah Kofman could not say. These were the silences that gathered at the centre of her life. Not only the death of her father, not only the horror of the camps, not only the general catastrophe that had befallen the Jewish people, but the particular, intimate, unspeakable complications of her own survival. The ways in which being saved had also been a kind of wounding, the ways in which she had been complicit in her own transformation, the ways in which she had loved what she should not have loved and abandoned what she should not have abandoned. And so she wrote about other things. She wrote about Nietzsche, who had declared that one must become who one is, that the task of life is to discover and affirm one's own nature, that the highest achievement is to look at everything that has happened and say, yes, I will this, I affirm this, I would live this again and again forever. And she understood, as she wrote about this doctrine, that she was writing about the question of whether she could affirm her own life, whether she could look at the little girl who had eaten the forbidden foods and loved the wrong woman and betrayed her father's memory, and say, yes, this too is me, this too I affirm. She wrote about Freud, who had discovered that the self is not a unity but a battlefield, that we are divided against ourselves, that we desire what we do not want and fear what we desire, that the unconscious speaks in symptoms and slips and dreams, saying the things we cannot say, revealing the truths we cannot face. And she understood as she explored these ideas that she was exploring her own division, her own internal warfare, the way she was split between the daughter of the rabbi and the child who ate ham, between the philosopher who spoke in public and the survivor who could not speak at all. The years passed. The 1980s became the 1990s. Her mother aged, grew frail, and finally, at an age that was itself a kind of miracle given everything she had survived, her mother died. And something shifted then. Something that had been held in place, held down, held back, began to move. The death of her mother was not a liberation, not exactly. It was not as if she had been waiting for permission, had been counting the days until she could finally speak. But there was a change in the nature of the silence. It was no longer protecting anyone. It was no longer serving any purpose except its own perpetuation. It was simply there, a weight that she carried, a stone in her chest, a thing that had become so much a part of her that she did not know who she would be without it. And the culture around her was changing too. The memory of the Holocaust, which had once been something private, something that survivors carried alone or shared only among themselves, was becoming public, becoming institutionalized, becoming a matter of museums and memorials and official commemorations. There were new archives being created, new oral history projects, new efforts to capture the testimonies of the survivors before it was too late. Claude Lanzmann had made his film Shoah, 9 hours of testimony and landscape, of survivors and perpetrators and bystanders speaking into the camera, of the slow, patient accumulation of memory that was also a kind of monument. And there were other films, other books, other testimonies, a vast outpouring of memory that was both necessary and troubling, both a way of preserving what had happened and a way of turning it into something consumable, something that could be watched and read and discussed and then set aside, returned to the shelf, filed away under history. Sarah Kofman watched this happening. She read the memoirs and the testimonies. She saw how other survivors were speaking, were telling their stories, were making their silences into words, and she felt perhaps a kind of envy. She felt perhaps a kind of longing. She felt perhaps the stirring of something that had been buried for so long that she had almost forgotten it was there. The desire to speak, the need to say what had happened, the realization that if she did not say it, no one would, that her particular story, her particular silences would simply disappear, would become part of the vast ocean of everything that is never said, everything that is lost. But how does one begin? After so many years of silence, after so many thousands of pages of philosophy, after constructing an entire identity around the refusal to speak directly, how does one begin to say the simple things, the terrible things, the things that are not philosophical at all but simply biographical, simply human, simply the story of a little girl whose father was taken away and did not come back? She began, as perhaps she could only begin, by circling, by approaching the thing indirectly, by writing about autobiography itself, about the genre of confession, about what it means to write about oneself and whether such a thing is even possible. She wrote about the philosophical problems of self-knowledge, about the ways in which the self that writes is never the same as the self that is written about the gap between experience and language, between memory and truth. She was, in a sense, preparing the ground. She was building the theoretical framework within which her own confession might eventually find a place. She was doing what she had always done, using philosophy as a tool, as a method, as a way of approaching what could not be approached directly. And then, finally, she wrote a book. A small book, barely more than a pamphlet, less than 100 pages. It was published in 1994, in the spring, just a few months before she died. It was called Rue Ordonnée, Rue Labat, 2 streets in Paris, the street where she had lived with her family before the war, and the street where the woman named Mémé had hidden her. 2 addresses that contained her entire childhood, her entire split identity, her entire wound. The book was not like her other books. It was not philosophical in the usual sense. There were no citations, no footnotes, no engagement with other thinkers, no elaborate theoretical frameworks. It was simple, it was direct, it was written in short sentences, almost childlike in their simplicity, as if she had finally found the voice of the girl she had been, the voice that had been silenced for 50 years. She wrote about her father, she wrote about the day he was taken, she wrote about the yellow star and the hiding and the fear, she wrote about Mémé and the forbidden foods and the love that was also a betrayal. She wrote about her mother and the fight and the impossible division. She wrote about everything she had not been able to say. It was, by the standards of Holocaust literature, a modest work. It made no grand claims. It proposed no theories. It simply told a story, her story, the story that had been waiting inside her for half a century. And yet, for those who knew her, for those who had read her philosophical works, it was a revelation. It was the key that unlocked everything else. It was the confession that had been hidden in all those pages about Nietzsche and Freud, the secret that had been speaking all along without ever quite being said. She dedicated the book to Mémé, the woman who had saved her. This was perhaps the most difficult thing of all, to acknowledge publicly her love for this woman, to say in print that she had been happier in that woman's house than in her mother's, to admit that survival had been complicated, that gratitude and betrayal had been intertwined, that she had been divided against herself from the very beginning and had never been able to make herself whole. The book appeared in the spring of 1994. The reviews were respectful, even admiring. Readers recognised that something important was happening, that a major philosopher was finally breaking her silence, that the private wound behind the public work was being revealed, and Sarah Kofman, for the first time in her life, was able to speak about her childhood, to answer questions about her father, to discuss the years of hiding in interviews and conversations. The silence was broken. The stone was lifted. The thing that could not be said had finally been said. And one might think that this would be a kind of liberation. One might imagine that having finally spoken, having finally put the words on paper, having finally broken the silence that had defined her for so long, she would feel a kind of relief, a lightening, a release from the burden that had weighed on her for 50 years. One might hope that the book would be a kind of healing, that the act of testimony would repair what had been broken, that the words would do what words sometimes do, which is to transform suffering into meaning, to make sense of what seemed senseless, to find in the telling of the story a way of going on. But that is not what happened. That is not what happens, not always, not for everyone. Sometimes speaking makes things worse. Sometimes breaking the silence is not a release, but a rupture. Not a healing, but a reopening of the wound. Not a transformation of suffering into meaning, but simply a reliving of the suffering. A return to the scene of the crime, a descent into the darkness that had been kept at bay, precisely by the refusal to speak of it. She had spent 50 years building a life around that silence. She had constructed an identity, a career, a body of work, a whole way of being in the world, all of it organised around the central absence, the thing that could not be said. And now she had said it, and the structure that had held her together for all those years was gone. The walls had come down, the floodwaters had been released, and she was alone with her memories, with her guilt, with her grief, with the little girl who had eaten the forbidden foods and loved the wrong woman and could not save her father, the little girl who had never gone away, who had been there all along, waiting in the silence, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge her existence. The summer passed, the autumn came, the leaves turned yellow and red and fell from the trees, as they do every year, as they will continue to do long after all of us are gone. And in her apartment in Paris, in the city where she had been born and hidden and educated and made her life, Sarah Kofman was coming to the end of something. She was approaching a threshold. She was nearing a place from which there is no return. The date had been circling in her mind for months, perhaps for years, perhaps for her entire life. October 15th, 1994. It would be the 150th anniversary of Friedrich Nietzsche's birth. The philosopher who had written so much about the will to live, about the affirmation of existence, about saying yes to life even in the face of suffering, had been born on that day in 1844 in a small town in Saxony, to a Lutheran pastor and his young wife. And Sarah Kofman, who had spent decades reading and rereading his words, who had written more penetratingly about his philosophy than almost anyone else in her generation, who had returned to his texts again and again as if searching for something she could never quite find, knew the date as intimately as she knew her own birthday. It had a weight, a gravity, a significance that she could not ignore. We do not know when she first began to think of it. We do not know when the idea took shape, when the possibility became a plan, when the plan became a decision. These are the things that happen in the privacy of a mind, in the silence between thoughts, in the darkness that no one else can see. What we know is that in the autumn of 1994, as the days grew shorter and the light grew pale, as Paris prepared for another winter, Sarah Kofman was moving towards something. She was approaching a date that had been marked on some invisible calendar, circled in ink that only she could read. There is a passage in Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, where he writes about what he calls the great health, the capacity to endure suffering, to take on oneself the heaviest burdens, to say yes to life not in spite of its pain but because of it. He writes about the strength that it takes to affirm existence, to embrace the eternal return, to want nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. This was the Nietzsche that Sarah Kofman had spent her career explicating, the Nietzsche of affirmation, of joy, of the tragic wisdom that says yes to life, even as it acknowledges that life includes death, that creation includes destruction, that every moment contains within it the seeds of its own dissolution. But there was another Nietzsche too, the Nietzsche who had collapsed on a street in Turin in January 1889, who had spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of complete mental dissolution, who had been cared for first by his mother and then by his sister, who had never written another word, who had sat in silence while his ideas were distorted and his name was appropriated by forces he would have despised. The Nietzsche who had written so boldly about strength and will, and the overcoming of all that is weak and sick in humanity, and who had ended his conscious life as an invalid, helpless, dependent, unable to recognise his own reflection in the mirror. There was a lesson in that ending too, a lesson about the limits of philosophy, about the gap between what we write and what we live, about the fact that all our words, however brilliant, however true, cannot protect us from what is coming. Sarah Kofman had written about this as well. She had written about Nietzsche's madness, about the question of whether his philosophy was a cause or a symptom or neither, about the strange relationship between his thought and his life. She had refused the easy interpretations, the reductions that tried to explain away the philosophy by pointing to the biography, or that tried to ignore the biography by insisting that only the philosophy mattered. She had held both in tension, as she always did, as she had been trained to do, as the philosophers of suspicion had taught her to do. Nothing is simple, everything is doubled, the surface conceals the depths, and the depths conceal still deeper depths, and at the very bottom there is perhaps nothing at all, or perhaps something that cannot be named. And now she was approaching the anniversary of his birth, 150 years. A round number, a significant number, the kind of number that marks a milestone, that invites commemoration, that calls for speeches and conferences and special editions, and all the rituals by which we try to keep the dead alive. October 15th, 1994, a Saturday. The leaves falling in the Jardin du Luxembourg, the cafes filling with the usual crowd, the city going about its business as cities do, as Paris always does, indifferent to the private dramas unfolding behind its countless windows. We can imagine her in those final weeks, though imagination is a dangerous thing, a way of imposing narrative on what resists narrative, of finding meaning where there may have been only chaos. We can imagine her going about her daily life, teaching her classes, meeting with students, reading the books that were always piled on her desk. We can imagine her walking through the streets she had known since childhood, past the places where she had hidden, past the schools where she had studied, past the bookshops where she had discovered the philosophers who would become her life's work. We can imagine her eating her meals alone in her apartment, looking out the window at the grey October sky, thinking thoughts that we will never know. But imagination fails here. It always fails when confronted with the truly private, the truly interior, the places where another person's consciousness becomes impenetrable. We cannot know what she was thinking. We cannot know what she was feeling. We can only know what she did and what she left behind, and the date that she chose, and the silence that followed. The book had been published. The secret had been told. The silence that had defined her for 50 years had been broken. And perhaps that was the problem. Perhaps the silence had been load-bearing, a wall that had held back the floodwaters, a structure that had given her something to push against, something to define herself in opposition to. And now the wall was gone, and the waters were rushing in, and she was drowning in memories that she had spent her whole life trying to keep at bay. There is a concept in psychoanalysis called acting out, which refers to the way that repressed material sometimes returns not as memory, not as thought, not as words, but as action. The thing that cannot be said expresses itself in behaviour, in symptoms, in repetitions that the person does not understand and cannot control. Freud wrote about this, and Sarah Kofman had written about what Freud had written, had analysed his concepts, had questioned his assumptions, had tried to understand what it meant to say that we are not masters in our own house, that there are forces within us that operate according to their own logic, that we are divided against ourselves in ways we cannot fully comprehend. She had made a career of understanding these ideas. She had spent decades explaining them to others, and now, perhaps, she was living them, enacting them, becoming an example of the very phenomena she had studied. But we should be careful here. We should be careful not to turn her death into a case study, not to reduce her to a symptom, not to explain away the mystery of her ending by wrapping it in the concepts she herself had analysed. That would be a betrayal of her work, which was always about resisting easy explanations, about holding complexity and tension, about refusing to let the surface stand in for the depths. Her death was not a philosophical demonstration. It was not a proof of anything. It was the end of a life, and like all endings, it remains partially opaque to us, partially beyond our understanding, partially hidden in the silence that she took with her. What we can say is that she was tired. 50 years of carrying the weight of her childhood. 50 years of guilt and grief and the impossible question of survival. 50 years of working, of writing, of building a career, of making a life out of the ruins of what had been destroyed. And now, at 60 years old, with the book finally written, with the secret finally told, With the silence finally broken, she was perhaps ready to rest. Perhaps she had done what she came to do. Perhaps there was nothing left to say. The summer had passed. The book had been reviewed. She had given interviews, had answered questions, had spoken publicly about the things she had kept private for so long. She had described her father, the rabbi with the sad eyes. She had described her mother, the woman who had become a stranger. She had described Meme, the woman who had saved her and complicated her. She had described the child who had eaten the ham and the rabbit, who had learned to love what was forbidden, who had been torn between two worlds and had never been able to choose. She had put it all into words, as she had always done, as she had been trained to do, but words, she knew better than anyone, are not enough. Words cannot heal what has been broken. Words cannot bring back the dead. Words cannot undo what has been done. October came. The days grew shorter. The light in Paris took on that particular quality it has in autumn, soft and golden in the afternoons, grey and melancholy in the mornings. The chestnut trees dropped their leaves. The flower sellers set up their stalls along the boulevards. The city prepared for the season of remembrance, the season of All Saints and All Souls, the season when the living think about the dead. And in her apartment, Sarah Kofman was thinking about the dead. She was thinking about her father, who had been taken from the Rue Ordonnay in 1942, who had been transported to Drancy and then to Auschwitz, who had died in a place she had never seen, in a way she could not imagine, at a time she did not know. She was thinking about the other children who had not survived, the ones who had been discovered in their hiding places, the ones who had been betrayed, the ones who had been taken to the trains and sent to the camps and turned into smoke and ash. She was thinking about the world that had been destroyed, the world of her childhood, the world of the synagogues and the Torah scrolls and the prayers in Hebrew, the world that Hitler and his followers had tried to erase from the face of the earth. And she was thinking, perhaps, about her own survival, about the strange guilt of being alive when so many had died, about the question that she had carried with her for 50 years. Why me? There is no answer to that question. There never was, and there never will be. Survival is not a moral category. It is not a reward for virtue or a punishment for sin. It is simply what happened, the arbitrary outcome of forces too large and too chaotic to comprehend. Some people lived, and some people died, and the difference between them was often nothing more than luck, chance, the accident of being in one place rather than another, of being hidden by one person rather than another, of being overlooked by one guard rather than noticed by another. The survivors knew this. They knew that they were not better than the dead, not more deserving, not more worthy of life. They knew that their survival was a kind of accident, a fluke, a random gift from a universe that did not care whether they lived or died. And this knowledge was a burden. It was a weight that they carried with them always, a shadow that fell across even their happiest moments, a voice that whispered in the silence, "You should be dead, you should be with them, you do not deserve to be here." Some survivors found ways to live with this burden. Some found meaning in their survival, purpose in their continued existence, reasons to go on. They built families, pursued careers, created art, told their stories, bore witness. They did what humans do, which is to find ways to keep living even when living seems impossible. But others did not. Others found the burden too heavy, the guilt too great, the memories too painful. Others reached a point where they could not go on, where the will to live that had sustained them through the war finally gave out, where the darkness that had been held at bay for so long finally closed in. And we should not judge them for this. We should not pretend that we know what they suffered, or that we have the right to tell them what they should have done. Their pain was their own, and their choices were their own, and the mystery of their endings belongs to them alone. Sarah Kofman had studied the question of suicide. She had read what the philosophers had written about it, from the Stoics who saw it as a rational choice, to the Christians who condemned it as a sin, to the moderns who tried to understand it as a symptom, a cry for help, a failure of mental health. She knew the arguments, the positions, the debates. She knew that Nietzsche himself had written about suicide, had seen it in some cases as a kind of triumph, a final assertion of the will, a refusal to submit to the indignity of decline. She knew that Freud had written about the death drive, the Todestrieb, the force within us that pulls toward destruction, toward dissolution, toward the return to the inorganic state from which we came. She had spent her career navigating between these two thinkers, these two ways of understanding the human condition, and now, perhaps, she was about to add her own contribution to the conversation, not in words but in action, not in theory but in practice. We do not know if she saw it that way. We do not know if she thought of her death as a philosophical statement, a symbolic gesture, a final word in the dialogue she had been conducting for decades. It is possible that she did. It is possible that the choice of date, the anniversary of Nietzsche's birth, was deliberate, intentional, meaningful. It is possible that she wanted to say something with her death, to make a point, to leave a message for those who would come after. But it is also possible that she was simply exhausted, that she had reached the end of her strength, that the date was a coincidence or at most a convenient marker, a way of giving shape to what was already inevitable. The truth is that we do not know, and we will never know. The dead keep their secrets. The silence that she entered on October 15th, 1994, is absolute, unbreakable, forever beyond our reach. All we have is what she left behind. The books, the essays, the lectures, the interviews, the memoir that she published just months before her death. All we have is the work, the record of a mind grappling with the deepest questions, the trace of a life that was lived at the intersection of history and philosophy, of trauma and thought, of silence and speech. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the work is what matters, the ideas that she contributed, the insights that she offered, the paths that she opened for others to follow. She would have been sceptical of this, of course. She would have questioned the very notion of legacy, of lasting contribution, of the survival of thought beyond the death of the thinker. She had written about the death of the author, about the way that texts escape their creators, about the impossibility of controlling how one's words will be read and interpreted. She knew that everything she had written would be misunderstood, distorted, appropriated, turned into something other than what she had intended. This is what happens to all writers, to all thinkers, to everyone who puts words on paper and sends them out into the world. We cannot control what becomes of us. We cannot ensure that we will be remembered correctly or remembered at all. But still, the work remains. The books are on the shelves. The ideas are in circulation. The questions that she asked are still being asked. The problems that she identified are still being wrestled with. The insights that she offered are still illuminating dark corners of thought. She changed the way we read Nietzsche, the way we read Freud, the way we think about the relationship between philosophy and life, between theory and practice, between what we write and who we are. She did this work, and the work survives, and that is something, even if it is not everything, even if it cannot bring her back, even if it cannot undo what was done, even if it cannot fill the silence that she left behind. The 15th of October approached. The city went on with its life. The students attended their classes. The professors gave their lectures. The philosophers argued about the same questions they had always argued about. And in her apartment, alone with her thoughts, alone with her memories, alone with the ghosts that had never left her, Sarah Kofman was preparing for the end. We do not know what form this preparation took. We do not know what she did in those final days, what she thought, what she felt. We only know that she was moving toward a threshold, crossing from one state to another, leaving behind the world of the living and entering the silence that awaits us all. There is a tendency, when we tell stories like this, to look for reasons, explanations, causes. We want to understand why she did what she did. We want to make sense of her death, to fit it into a narrative that gives it meaning, to find in the tragedy some kind of lesson or moral or takeaway. But perhaps the truest thing we can say is that we do not understand, that we cannot understand, that her death, like all deaths, remains partially mysterious, partially opaque, partially beyond the reach of our explanations. She was a philosopher who had spent her life questioning the easy answers. She had taught us to be suspicious of surface meanings, to look for what is hidden, to resist the temptation to reduce complexity to simplicity. And so perhaps the best tribute we can pay her is to resist the temptation to explain her death, to accept that it contains depths that we cannot fathom, to hold the mystery in tension rather than dissolving it into a neat conclusion. The leaves were falling, the light was fading, the anniversary was approaching, the day that had been circled on that invisible calendar, the day that she had chosen, or that had chosen her. And Sarah Kofman, the hidden child, the orphan, the philosopher, the writer, the woman who had survived when so many had not, was coming to the end of her story, approaching the final page, preparing to close the book and lay down her pen forever. What happened next is known to us only in its bare outlines: the date, the place, the fact, but the inner experience, the final thoughts, the last moments of consciousness, these remain hidden, as they always do, in the privacy of a mind that is no longer there to tell us what it contained. And perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps some things are not meant to be known. Perhaps some silences are sacred, inviolable, deserving of our respect rather than our curiosity. The 15th of October, 1994. A Saturday. The kind of autumn day that Paris has always known how to make. The light slanting golden through the chestnut trees, the café terraces still full of people unwilling to admit that summer had ended, the bookshops along the left bank with their doors propped open, the smell of old paper and possibility drifting into the street. A beautiful day in its way, a day like any other, and somewhere, in academic circles, in philosophy departments, in the quiet rooms where Nietzsche scholars gathered, there was acknowledgement of the anniversary. 150 years since Friedrich Nietzsche had been born in the small Saxon village of Rücken, the son of a Lutheran pastor who would die when his son was 4 years old. 150 years since the beginning of a life that would transform Western philosophy, that would challenge everything we thought we knew about truth and morality and the human condition. A significant anniversary, worth noting, worth commemorating. But for most of the world, for most of Paris, for most of the people going about their ordinary Saturday business, the date meant nothing in particular. It was simply the 15th of October. It was simply autumn. The leaves were falling as they fall every year, as they have fallen for longer than any of us can remember. The city went on with its life, indifferent and beautiful, ancient and endlessly renewed. In her apartment, Sarah Kofman made her final preparations. We do not know what these preparations were. We do not know if she spent the morning writing as she had spent so many mornings of her life. We do not know if she looked out her window at the city she had loved, the city that had both saved her and wounded her, the city where she had become who she was. We do not know if she thought of her mother, dead now for years, the relationship between them never fully healed. We do not know if she thought of her father, the rabbi whose face she could no longer clearly remember, whose absence had shaped everything that came after. We do not know if she thought of Mémé, the woman who had loved her and fed her, and wanted perhaps to keep her forever. We do not know if she thought of the underground room on the Rue Labat, the ration cards, the fear, the way a child's world can narrow to the size of a hiding place. We know only what the calendar told her, that this was the day, that Nietzsche had been born 150 years ago, that everything she had written about him, every insight she had offered, every question she had raised, every shadow she had illuminated in his work, all of it had been leading to this moment of convergence. The philosopher who had written about the eternal return, the endless repetition of all things, the great wheel of existence that turns and turns and brings us back to the same point again and again. On the anniversary of his birth, she chose to die. There is a precision to this that is almost unbearable, a symmetry so exact that it feels like a message, a final communication, a last philosophical statement written not in words but in the fact of the date itself. She was 70 years old. She had published more than 25 books. She had spent her entire adult life reading and thinking and writing about the deepest questions that philosophy can ask. And in the end, she chose a date that would turn her death into a kind of text, a gesture that demanded interpretation, a final puzzle left for those who remained behind. What did she mean by it? What was she trying to say? Was it a tribute to the philosopher who had given her so much, whose work had been her constant companion, whose thought had shaped her own? Was it an act of identification, a final merging with the figure who had occupied so much of her intellectual life? Was it a statement about philosophy itself, about the relationship between thought and existence, about the way ideas and lives intertwine until they become inseparable? Was it a last defiant act of authorship, a refusal to let death be something that simply happened to her, her insistence on choosing the time and place and meaning of her ending? Or was it something simpler, something more private, something that had to do not with public meanings but with personal necessity? Perhaps the date was simply when she was ready. Perhaps the coincidence was just that. A coincidence, noticed and embraced but not the point. Perhaps she'd been moving toward this moment for longer than anyone knew, and the anniversary of Nietzsche's birth simply happened to fall at the right time, or the wrong time, or the only time that made sense to her. We cannot know. The dead take their final reasons with them into whatever silence awaits. We are left with the facts, the dates, the texts, and the interpretations we construct from them. We are left doing what she taught us to do, reading carefully, looking for what is hidden, remaining suspicious of easy answers, holding multiple possibilities in tension rather than collapsing them into a single meaning. She died alone, in her apartment, on the 15th of October, 1994. The method she chose was asphyxiation. She had prepared it carefully, as she had prepared everything in her life, with the same precision and attention to detail that characterized her scholarship. There was no note, or if there was, it has not been made public. There was only the body, discovered later, and the date, and the life that had led to this moment. The news spread slowly at first, then faster. A phone call to a colleague, a worried friend who came to check on her, the police, the officials, the procedures that follow any death, the bureaucratic necessities that must be attended to, the paperwork and the arrangements and the notifications. And then, gradually, the word reaching the wider world, the philosophical community, the former students, the readers of her books, all the people whose lives she had touched without ever knowing most of their names. Sarah Kofman is dead. The philosopher who had survived so much, who had lost her father to Auschwitz and her childhood to the occupation, who had rebuilt herself through thought and language and the patient work of scholarship. She had chosen to end her life on Nietzsche's birthday. The shock of it. The sorrow. The questions that could not be answered. In the days and weeks that followed, there were tributes and memorials, the rituals by which we acknowledge the dead and try to make sense of their absence. Colleagues spoke of her brilliance, her intensity, her uncompromising intellectual standards. Students remembered her generosity, the way she took their work seriously, the way she pushed them to think more deeply. Friends recalled the other Sarah, the one who laughed and argued and lived fully in the world, the one who was more than her trauma, more than her scholarship, more than any single description could contain. But underneath all the tributes, there was the uncomfortable fact of how she'd died, the choice she had made, the date she had chosen. It was impossible to eulogize her without confronting the question of what had driven her to this end, without wondering whether there was something that could have been done, without feeling the specific sadness that accompanies suicide, the sense of a story cut short by its own author, the narrative broken off before its natural conclusion. And there were those who wondered whether the memoir had something to do with it, whether Rue Ordonnée, Rue Labarthe, with its painful excavation of her childhood, had been a kind of preparation, a necessary confession before the end, whether the act of finally saying what had been unsayable had been both a liberation and a dissolution, the removal of the last barrier between her and the abyss. She had held the silence for so long. She had kept the secret of her divided love, her divided self, her divided life. And when she finally spoke it, when she finally put it into words and sent it out into the world, perhaps there was nothing left to hold her here. Perhaps the telling was also a letting go. Or perhaps the memoir and the suicide were not cause and effect, but parallel expressions of the same underlying movement. Perhaps she had reached a point in her life where she needed to complete things, to bring them to an end, to say what needed to be said and then fall silent. The book was a completion. The death was a completion. Both were forms of closure, ways of drawing a line under a story that had been in progress for 70 years. But we must be careful here. We must be careful not to romanticize her death, not to turn it into something noble or meaningful or philosophically profound in a way that obscures the simple fact of its tragedy. A woman died. A brilliant, complicated, suffering woman ended her own life. Whatever reason she had, whatever meanings we might find in the date she chose or the life she had lived, the fundamental fact remains that she is gone, that her voice is silent, that the books she might have written will never be written, that the students she might have taught will never know her, that the world is diminished by her absence. Suicide is not a philosophical statement, or rather, it is not only a philosophical statement, it is also a death. It is also grief. It is also the loss of possibility, the foreclosure of future. It is also pain. Not just the pain that led to it, but the pain it leaves behind, rippling outward through the lives of everyone who knew her, everyone who loved her, everyone who depended on her presence in the world. To speak of her death only in terms of its philosophical resonance, only in terms of Nietzsche and eternal return and the convergence of dates, would be to miss the human fact at its centre. She was a person. She suffered. She died. And that is not a text to be interpreted, but a reality to be mourned. The years have passed, more than 30 years now since that October Saturday. The world has changed in ways she could not have foreseen, and ways that might not have surprised her at all. The questions she asked, about reading, about interpretation, about the relationship between life and thought, these questions remain open. The books she wrote are still read, still taught, still argued about. Her interpretation of Nietzsche is still essential for anyone who wants to understand him seriously. Her reading of Freud is still one of the most sophisticated and challenging that exists. Her attention to the figure of woman in philosophy, to the ways that gender shapes thought and thought shapes gender, remains relevant, perhaps more relevant than ever. And Rue Ordonnée, Rue là-bas, the little book she wrote at the end, has taken on a life of its own. It is read now not only as a memoir of the Holocaust, not only as a document of childhood trauma, but as a meditation on memory itself, on the way we construct our pasts, on the stories we tell and the stories we cannot tell, on the relationship between survival and guilt, between love and betrayal, between the child we were and the adult we become. It is read as a work of literature as much as autobiography. It is read as philosophy in the most personal form, and through it, new generations of readers encounter Sarah Kofman for the first time, come to know her not through the abstract arguments of her scholarly work, but through the intimate facts of her lived experience. She would have had complicated feelings about this, probably, about being known primarily through her suffering rather than her thought, about becoming a figure in Holocaust literature rather than a major philosopher in her own right, about the way that her death, with its precise and terrible date, has come to overshadow her life. She spent decades trying to prove that she was more than what had been done to her, more than the hidden child, more than the orphan, more than the survivor. She wanted to be taken seriously as a thinker, not pitied as a victim. And there is a danger, in telling her story this way, of doing exactly what she would have resisted, of reducing her to her trauma, of making the Holocaust the only lens through which we see her. But perhaps that tension cannot be resolved. Perhaps it is the tension at the heart of her work and her life. She was both, a major philosopher and a survivor of genocide, a rigorous scholar and a wounded child, a woman who controlled language with extraordinary precision, and a woman who carried a wound that language could never fully reach. To understand her, we have to hold both, to refuse the easy reduction in either direction. She was not only her suffering, but her suffering was not incidental to who she was. It shaped her as it shaped all the survivors. It gave her certain insights and certain blindnesses. It made her who she was, for better and for worse, until the end. The end. We keep coming back to it, as we must. The 15th of October, the anniversary, the apartment, the silence afterward. There is something about the way she died that refuses to let us rest, that keeps calling us back, that demands interpretation even as it resists it. Perhaps that is her final gift to us, her final teaching, this unresolvable question, this mystery that cannot be dissolved, this remainder that exceeds all our explanations. Nietzsche wrote about the eternal return as a test. If you were told that you would have to live your life again, exactly as you had lived it, every joy and every sorrow, every triumph and every failure, every moment of beauty and every moment of pain, would you be able to affirm it? Would you be able to say yes to your life, to embrace it in its totality, to want it again exactly as it was? This was, for Nietzsche, the ultimate affirmation, the highest form of love for existence. To say yes to everything, even the suffering, even the loss, even the parts you would do anything to change. Did Sarah Kofman say yes to her life? Did she in the end affirm it? Or did she refuse it? Is suicide a kind of no, a rejection of the eternal return, a declaration that this life is not worth repeating? Or is it possible that it was something else entirely? A yes so total that it included even this, even the ending, even the choice to stop. We cannot answer for her. We cannot know what was in her mind in those final moments, what thoughts accompanied her into the silence. We can only attend to what she left behind, the books, the words, the life of the mind that she lived so fully and so fiercely. We can only read her, carefully and slowly looking for what is hidden, remaining suspicious of easy answers. We can only do what she taught us to do. The leaves fell that autumn, as they fall every autumn. The light faded, as it fades every evening. The city went on with its life, as cities do, indifferent to the individual deaths that accumulate within them. And in the apartment on the Rue d'Ulm, or wherever she was in those last days, the silence gathered and deepened and finally became complete. But the books remain, the words remain, the questions remain. Sarah Kofman was born in Paris on the 18th of September 1934 to Jewish parents who had fled the rising tide of persecution in their native lands. She was 5 years old when the war began, 8 when her father was taken, 10 when the city was liberated. She survived by hiding, by being hidden, by becoming someone else, and then having to become herself again. She went to school, she went to university, she became a philosopher, a professor, a writer, she married and divorced, she loved and lost. She read everything and thought everything through, and put her thoughts into words and sent them out into the world. And on the 15th of October 1994, 150 years after Nietzsche's birth, she died. She was 70 years old. She had written more than 25 books. She had changed the way we read and think and understand. She had survived so much, lost so much, carried so much. And in the end, she laid down her burden and entered the silence. It is quiet now. The story is over, or as over as any story ever is. The facts have been told, the dates recorded, the books listed. What remains is not information but presence, the sense of a life, vivid and complicated and ultimately unknowable, passing through the world and leaving its mark. She was here, she mattered. She wrote things that are still worth reading, asked questions that are still worth asking, lived a life that is still worth contemplating. And now the night is deep, and the words have said what they can say, and the time has come for silence. Not the silence of ending, but the silence of continuation. The silence in which thought goes on, in which memory persists, in which the dead remain with us in the only way they can. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the story settle into you. Let it become part of what you carry. Another layer in the sediment of things you know and feel and half remember. Somewhere, in a library, on a shelf, her books are waiting for the next reader. Somewhere, in a classroom, a student is encountering her work for the first time. Somewhere, in the quiet hours of the night, someone is thinking about the questions she raised, the doors she opened, the ways of seeing she made possible, and somewhere, deeper than anywhere we can reach, in the place where the past and the present and the possible all come together, Sarah Kofman is at rest. The hidden child is no longer hiding. The philosopher has finished her work. The daughter has rejoined her father in whatever reunion awaits beyond the reach of words. The silence has welcomed her home. Sleep now. The story will still be here in the morning, and so will you, and so will all the questions that make us human. But for now, for this moment, for this quiet hour in the dark, let the words fade, and the stillness deepen, and the night carry you wherever it will. She lived, she thought, she wrote, she loved, she suffered, she survived. And then, on a golden autumn day, she chose to stop. That is the story. That is all of it that words can hold. The rest is silence.